The heavy rain pounded against the tinted windows of the black Bentley as it pulled up to the towering glass apartment building on Park Avenue. Robert Chen sighed deeply as he loosened his Italian silk tie. The business trip to Singapore had been a complete disaster. 3 months of video calls, contract drafts, and careful planning had fallen apart in a single afternoon when the investors backed out at the last minute. "Will you need anything else this evening, sir?" asked his driver, catching Robert's tired eyes in the rearview mirror. "No, thank you, Frank. Go home to your family. It's already late." Robert grabbed his leather briefcase and stepped out into the rain. The doorman rushed forward with an umbrella, but Robert barely noticed the gesture as he walked into the marble lobby, his mind still replaying the failed negotiation. At 56, Robert had built his tech company from nothing. The son of Chinese immigrants who had worked double shifts at their small grocery store to put him through college, he had never taken success for granted. But tonight, the weight of the failed deal pressed heavily on his shoulders. It would mean delaying the launch of their newest software platform by at least 6 months, disappointing shareholders, and possibly laying off some of the development team. The private elevator whisked him up to the penthouse on the 48th floor. All he wanted now was a stiff drink, a hot shower, and to fall into bed. He hadn't even called ahead to let Louisa know he was coming home early. His housekeeper of 8 years wasn't expecting him until tomorrow evening. As the elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse foyer, Robert was surprised to hear music. Not the background playlist that automatically played throughout the apartment, but something live and passionate, a piano piece that filled the space with emotion so raw it stopped him in his tracks. Robert set down his briefcase quietly and followed the sound to the living room. The grand piano by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park usually sat untouched, a beautiful showpiece he had purchased during a phase when he thought he might take up playing again after abandoning it in college. Now someone was bringing it to life with extraordinary skill. He paused in the doorway, stunned by what he saw. Louisa, his housekeeper, sat at the piano, her back straight, her hands dancing across the keys. Her usual neat uniform had been replaced by simple jeans and a faded blue sweater. Her dark hair, loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its typical practical bun. The piece she played, Chopin, he was almost certain, flowed from her fingers with a grace and emotion that left him speechless. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying gently with the music, completely lost in the performance. This wasn't someone who had taken a few piano lessons. This was an artist. For nearly 5 minutes, Robert stood frozen, not wanting to break the spell. The worries of the failed business deal, the jet lag, the stress, all of it momentarily forgotten as he watched this unexpected scene unfold in his own home. The final notes hung in the air. Louisa sat motionless for a moment, hands resting lightly on the keys before she took a deep breath and opened her eyes. That's when she saw him. She jumped up from the bench so quickly she nearly knocked it over. "Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry, I thought you were in Singapore until tomorrow." Her face had drained of color, hands nervously smoothing down her sweater. "I should never have touched the piano without permission. I was finished with my work, and I thought since you were away." Her voice trailed off, the panic evident in her wide brown eyes. Robert raised his hand gently. "Please, Louisa. There's nothing to apologize for." He walked closer, still processing what he had witnessed. That was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, wasn't it? Surprise flickered across her face. "Yes, it was." "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, genuine amazement in his voice. Louisa looked down, her shoulders tense. "I should finish preparing your room. You must be tired from your trip." "The room can wait," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "Please sit down. I'd like to hear about this." Hesitantly, Louisa perched on the edge of the piano bench while Robert took a seat in the armchair across from her. In all the years she had worked in his home, keeping it spotless, preparing his meals, and managing the household with quiet efficiency, they had never really had a conversation beyond pleasantries and household matters. "I studied at the National Conservatory in Bogota," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In Colombia, before I came to the United States." You were a concert pianist? Robert couldn't hide his surprise. Louisa smiled faintly. Almost. I was on that path. I had scholarships, good teachers. When I was 22, I was preparing for an international competition in Vienna that could have launched my career. The smile faded. Then my father became very sick. Cancer. My mother had died years before, and my younger brothers were still in school. Robert watched as her hands, the same hands that dusted his bookshelves and prepared his meals, twisted together in her lap. We had no money for his treatments. The competition was months away, with no guarantee I would win any prize money. So I left school, took any job I could find. When a cousin in New York offered to help me come here, I thought I could make more money to send home. She shrugged. By the time my father passed away, 2 years had gone by. My brothers needed help with university costs. And me? I was just a woman with no degree, no papers, and no connections in a foreign country. But your talent, Robert said, leaning forward. Didn't you try to pursue music here? Louisa's laugh held no humor. Without a work visa, without money for auditions or proper clothes, without anyone to recommend me? She shook her head. I cleaned houses during the day and offices at night. I was grateful for the work. When my youngest brother finished school 5 years ago, I finally got my green card through a special program for long-term workers. By then, I was 35, too old to start again in classical music. She stood up suddenly. I really should prepare your room, Mr. Chen, and perhaps some dinner? You must be hungry after your flight. Robert barely heard her. His mind was racing. In the tech world, he had built his reputation on seeing potential where others saw nothing, in overlooked startups, in undervalued patents, in young programmers with unconventional backgrounds. Yet here was extraordinary talent right under his roof, serving him coffee and making his bed for 8 years, and he had never seen it. How often do you play? He asked, ignoring her attempt to return to her duties. Louisa's cheeks flushed slightly. Only when you travel. I would never presume to... No, I mean, how often do you play anywhere? Do you have access to a piano elsewhere? She shook her head. There is a community center near my apartment with an old upright. Sometimes I go on my day off, but it's not very good. And there are usually children taking lessons. Her expression softened. I'm sorry again for using yours without permission. It's just such a beautiful instrument, and it helps me remember who I used to be. Robert stood up, suddenly decisive. Louisa, I'd like to hear you play again. Properly this time, not me spying from the doorway. And then I'd like to tell you about a foundation I support that helps immigrant artists. Louisa stared at him, confusion evident in her expression. But your room, your dinner, can wait, Robert said firmly. I've had a rough day losing a business deal I thought was certain. I could use some beautiful music right now, much more than I need a turned-down bed. Slowly, as if afraid he might change his mind, Louisa returned to the piano bench. She took a deep breath, positioned her hands, and looked up at him with uncertainty. Play whatever you love most, Robert said, settling into the armchair. Louisa nodded and began to play. This time, knowing she had an audience, there was a moment of hesitation, a slight stiffness in her posture. But within seconds, the music took over again. Her fingers glided across the keys, bringing to life Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, with such passion and technical precision that Robert felt a chill run down his spine. As the powerful notes filled the penthouse, Robert closed his eyes. The failed Singapore deal, the meetings tomorrow, the quarterly reports due next week, all of it seemed distant and somehow less important. In that moment, watching the transformation of his quiet, efficient housekeeper into this commanding artist, Robert Chen knew that something significant had shifted in his carefully ordered world. And he had a feeling that neither of them would ever quite return to the roles they had played before tonight. The morning after discovering Louisa's hidden talent, Robert woke earlier than usual. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of her playing still echoing in his mind. After she had finished the Rachmaninoff piece, they had talked for nearly 2 hours. Robert had ordered food from his favorite Thai restaurant, and they had eaten together in the kitchen, not the formal dining room where she usually served his meals. It had been oddly comfortable, this new dynamic between them. Louisa had gradually relaxed, sharing stories of her childhood in Colombia, how she had first fallen in love with piano at age 6 when a music teacher visited her school, and how her parents had scraped together money for lessons by taking extra work. Robert found himself sharing, too, about his own parents' grocery store in Queens, the scholarship that had changed his life, and his regret at abandoning his own modest musical talents for the more practical path of computer science. Now, as sunlight streamed through the windows of his bedroom, Robert reached for his phone. He had an idea that had kept him awake half the night. He sent a quick text to his assistant. Need to reschedule today's meetings. Personal matter. When he walked into the kitchen 30 minutes later, showered and dressed in casual clothes instead of his usual suit, Louisa was already there preparing breakfast. She had returned to her usual self, hair pulled back, wearing her gray uniform, efficient and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she said, sliding a perfectly made omelet onto a plate. Her voice was polite but careful, as if she was unsure how to navigate their relationship after last night's revelations. "Robert," he corrected gently. "After last night, I think we can use first names, don't you?" Louisa looked up, a flash of uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Chen." Robert sat down at the kitchen island. "The woman who played Rachmaninoff in my living room last night isn't just my housekeeper, Louisa. She's an artist. I'd like to know that person better." Louisa turned away, busying herself with wiping down the already spotless counter. "Last night was unusual. I crossed a line using your piano without permission. It won't happen again." "That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about," Robert said, taking a sip of the coffee she had placed in front of him. "I've cleared my schedule today. I'd like you to come with me somewhere." Louisa finally turned to face him. "Where?" "It's a surprise, but it's important." He glanced at her uniform. "And you might want to change into something more comfortable. We'll be out most of the day." An hour later, they were sitting in the back of Robert's car as Frank drove them through the bustling streets of Manhattan. Louisa had changed into dark slacks and a simple blue blouse. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, looking out the window. "When was the last time you performed? In front of an audience, I mean," Robert asked. Louisa turned to him, surprised by the question. "A real performance? In a concert hall? That would have been almost 15 years ago, just before I left Bogota." Her eyes took on a distant look. It was a student showcase at the conservatory. "I played Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23. A small smile touched her lips. "My father came. He was already sick then, but he wouldn't miss it. He sold his watch to buy a new suit for the occasion." Robert watched her face carefully. "Do you miss it? Performing?" Louisa was quiet for a long moment. "I try not to think about it. What's the point of missing something that can never be yours again?" Before Robert could respond, the car pulled up in front of an imposing stone building. "We're here," he said. Louisa looked out the window, her eyes widening. "The Manhattan School of Music?" "Why are we here?" Robert smiled. "Come and see." They walked through the grand entrance, Robert nodding to the security guard as if he were a regular visitor. He led Louisa down several hallways until they reached a door marked Studio 7. He knocked once, then opened it. Inside was a spacious room dominated by a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Standing by the window was a slender man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "Ah, Robert. Right on time," the man said, stepping forward to shake Robert's hand. He turned to Louisa with a warm smile. "And you must be Louisa. I'm Daniel Hoffman, head of the piano department here at MSM." Louisa shot a confused look at Robert, who explained, "Daniel is an old friend. We were roommates in college before he went on to Juilliard. He's one of the most respected piano instructors in the country." "Robert called me this morning with quite an interesting story," Daniel said, studying Louisa with kind but appraising eyes. "He tells me you're something of a hidden virtuoso." Louisa's face flushed. "Mr. Chen is being far too generous. I studied years ago, but—" "She's being modest," Robert interrupted. "Daniel, you should have heard her play Rachmaninoff last night. It was extraordinary," Daniel smiled. "Well, that's why we're here, isn't it? To hear for ourselves." He gestured to the piano. "Would you play something for me, Louisa?" "Whatever you feel comfortable with." Panic flashed across Louisa's face. "Now I'm not prepared. I haven't seriously practiced in years." Just pretend you're alone in the penthouse again, Robert said gently. Play what moves you. Louisa looked from Robert to Daniel, then slowly walked to the piano. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began to play. She started with Bach, a prelude in C minor that began softly but grew increasingly complex. Her technique was slightly rusty at first, but within minutes she had found her rhythm. When she finished the Bach, she transitioned seamlessly into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a technically demanding piece that showcased both delicate precision and passionate force. Robert watched Daniel's face as Louisa played. The professor's expression changed from polite interest to surprise, and finally to something approaching awe. When Louisa finished, the room fell silent except for her slightly heavy breathing. Daniel walked slowly to the piano. That was remarkable, especially for someone who hasn't had formal training in 15 years. He looked at her with genuine curiosity. Why aren't you performing? With talent like yours? Louisa looked down at the keys. Life took a different turn. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, Daniel agreed. Sometimes more than once. He exchanged a glance with Robert. Louisa, would you mind waiting outside for a moment? There's a small courtyard through that door. Robert and I need to discuss something. Once Louisa had left, Daniel turned to Robert with raised eyebrows. You weren't exaggerating. She's got something special. What do you think? Is it too late? Robert asked. Daniel shook his head. For a traditional concert career? Starting from scratch at her age would be difficult, but there are other paths. He thought for a moment. She needs proper instruction to polish her technique again, a good piano to practice on regularly, and eventually opportunities to perform. I can provide all of that, Robert said without hesitation. Daniel gave him a measured look. May I ask why? You said she's been your housekeeper for 8 years. Why this sudden interest in her musical career? Robert walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where Louisa sat on a bench, her face tilted up to catch the sunlight. Last night, watching her play, it was like seeing someone come alive after being half asleep for years. I know what it's like to have dreams put aside. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, did you know that? When I chose computer science instead, my father didn't speak to me for months. He turned back to Daniel, but at least I got to choose my path. Louisa never got that choice. Life forced her hand. He paused. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, Daniel. What good is it if I can't use some of it to right that kind of wrong? Daniel studied his old friend's face. Just be careful, Robert. Make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. And make sure she understands there are no strings attached. When they called Louisa back in and explained their proposal, private lessons with Daniel twice a week, daily access to a practice room at the school, and eventually, a recital, her reaction wasn't what Robert expected. Instead of excitement, he saw hesitation and doubt. This is incredibly generous, she said carefully, but I work 6 days a week. I have rent to pay, bills. You'd still be employed by me, Robert assured her. Same salary, but different duties. Instead of cleaning my penthouse, your job would be to practice and study. Think of it as a scholarship if that makes it easier to accept. Louisa stood very still, her expression unreadable. Why would you do this for me, Mr. Chen? Robert chose his words carefully. Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted dusting furniture and making beds. Because music matters. And because I can. Louisa looked at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the polished wood. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. What if I've lost too much time? What if I'm not good enough anymore? Daniel stepped forward. The only way to find out is to try. And from what I heard today, you have nothing to fear. Robert watched as something shifted in Louisa's expression, a spark of hope she seemed almost afraid to acknowledge. She looked up at them both, and for the first time that day she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. When do we start? She asked. 6 weeks had passed since that life-changing day at the Manhattan School of Music. Spring had fully arrived in New York City, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed perfectly timed for the changes in both Robert and Louisa's lives. The transition hadn't been seamless. The first week, Louisa had shown up at the penthouse at her usual early hour, dressed in her uniform, unable to break the habit of 8 years. Robert had found her cleaning the kitchen when he came out for coffee. What are you doing? He had asked, confused. I thought I would get some work done before my lesson, she had replied, not meeting his eyes. Louisa, we talked about this. Your work is the piano now. She had put down the cleaning cloth reluctantly. It doesn't feel right taking money and not earning it. Robert had understood then how difficult this adjustment would be for her. Pride and independence had carried her through 15 years in a foreign country. Accepting help, even when framed as employment, challenged her sense of self. You are earning it, he had insisted gently. By working just as hard at the piano as you did keeping this place spotless. Now 6 weeks later, they had found a new rhythm. Louisa came to the penthouse 3 days a week to practice on Robert's grand piano. The other days, she worked with Daniel at the school. Robert had hired a new housekeeper, an energetic Ukrainian woman named Olena, who kept the penthouse clean but didn't make coffee exactly the way he liked it. Robert found himself scheduling more work-from-home days, often sitting in his home office with the door open so he could hear Louisa practice. The music filled the space that had once felt so empty, even with all its expensive furnishings. Today was one of those days. Robert was on a video call with investors when he heard Louisa arrive. The sound of her setting down her bag and the soft opening and closing of the piano bench reached him even through his closed office door. He rushed through the last few minutes of his meeting, eager to hear what she was working on today. When he stepped into the living room, Louisa was focused intently on a piece he hadn't heard before, something modern with challenging rhythms. She didn't notice him at first, and he took the opportunity to observe the changes in her. Her posture was different now, confident, commanding. She had cut her hair into a stylish bob that framed her face, and her clothes were new, still simple but well-fitting and elegant. When she finished, he applauded. She looked up, no longer startled by his presence as she had been that first night. That was beautiful, he said. Something new? Louisa nodded, a smile lighting up her face. Philip Glass. Daniel thinks I should expand my repertoire beyond the classical standards. She hesitated. Do you have a moment? I'd like to show you something. She reached into her bag and pulled out a large envelope. From it, she extracted a glossy brochure and handed it to Robert. The Kaufman Music Center is hosting a special concert series featuring returning artists, musicians who left the field and are making comebacks. Daniel submitted my name and she took a deep breath. They want me to perform next month. Robert looked from the brochure to Louisa's face, noticing the mixture of excitement and terror in her eyes. That's wonderful. Your first public performance, where? It's a small venue, just the recital hall, not the main stage. But still, actual tickets, actual strangers. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. You're ready, Robert said with certainty. I've heard how much you've improved even in these few weeks. Louisa shook her head. Technically, maybe, but performing is different. The pressure, the audience, she looked away. I haven't played for a real audience in so long. What if I freeze? What if I forget the music? What if they laugh? Robert recognized the spiral of self-doubt in her voice. He had seen it in young entrepreneurs pitching their first big investors, in new employees giving presentations to the board. But this was different, more personal, more vulnerable. Tell me about your first big performance, he said. When you were studying in Bogota. The question seemed to surprise her. I was 16, she said after a moment. A competition for young pianists. I played Mozart. Were you nervous? A small smile touched her lips. Terrified. I threw up twice backstage. And yet you went out there anyway. You played. I had no choice. My parents had spent money they didn't have on my lessons, on my dress for the performance. My teacher had invested so much time in me. Did you win? Second place, Louisa said, the memory bringing a hint of the old disappointment. Robert leaned forward. And how did you feel on stage once you started playing? Louisa's expression changed, becoming distant as she remembered. Like I was somewhere else, somewhere, above everything. The nerves disappeared once my fingers touched the keys. That's still in you, Louisa, it never left. Robert gestured to the piano. I've watched you these past weeks. When you play, you transform. The housekeeper disappears and the artist emerges. He tapped the brochure. The audience will see that artist, not your fear. Louisa studied his face. You really believe that? I do, he said simply. She nodded slowly. Then I need to practice even more. The program I've chosen is challenging. What will you play? Bach's Partita No. 2, 2 Chopin etudes, and Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. She looked down at her hands. "And I've added one more piece. Something unexpected." Before Robert could ask what she meant, his phone rang, his assistant calling about an urgent matter with a client in Tokyo. By the time he finished the call, Louisa had returned to practicing and he didn't want to interrupt her focus. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Louisa practiced with increasing intensity as the concert approached. Robert found himself deeply invested in her progress, rearranging meetings to attend her lessons with Daniel when invited, offering encouragement when she hit difficult passages, and celebrating with her when she mastered them. One evening, a week before the concert, Robert came home to find not just Louisa at the piano, but a young man sitting beside her on the bench. They were playing a duet, their four hands moving in perfect synchronization, their shoulders occasionally touching as they swayed with the music. They were so engrossed that they didn't notice Robert until the piece ended. "Oh, Mr. Chen," Louisa said, standing quickly. "I didn't hear you come in." She gestured to the young man who had also risen. "This is my son, Antonio. He arrived from Bogota yesterday. I hope it's all right that I brought him here." Robert had known Louisa had a son, but somehow had pictured a child. Not this tall young man with serious eyes and his mother's elegant hands. "Of course it's all right," Robert said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Antonio. I didn't know you played as well." Antonio shook Robert's hand firmly. "Not like my mother. I study engineering, but I keep up with piano as a hobby." His English was excellent, accented but fluent. "Thank you for what you've done for her. When she told me about this opportunity, I had to come see it for myself." "Your mother is the one doing all the work," Robert said. "I'm just providing the piano." Louisa and Antonio exchanged a look that told Robert there was more to the story than what he'd been told. "Actually," Louisa said carefully, "Antonio is here to help me with the surprise element of my program. The unexpected piece I mentioned. May I hear it?" Robert asked. Louisa hesitated. "Not yet. I want it to be a surprise for you too." At the concert. The night of the performance arrived with all the nervous energy of any artistic debut. Robert had purchased tickets for the front row and had invited Daniel and his wife, as well as a few carefully selected friends who he thought would appreciate the significance of the evening. The Kaufman Music Center's recital hall was an intimate space that seated about 200 people. A modest venue by New York standards, but it was nearly full, many attendees drawn by the unique concept of the Returning Artists series. When Louisa walked onto the stage in a deep blue gown that caught the light as she moved, Robert barely recognized the woman who had served him coffee for 8 years. She approached the piano with grace, acknowledged the audience with a small bow, and took her seat. Her hands hovered over the keys for just a moment, a breath, a prayer before she began the Bach. From the first notes, it was clear to everyone in the hall that they were witnessing something special. Louisa played with technical precision but also with deep emotion, bringing a modern sensibility to the Baroque piece that made it feel fresh and alive. The Chopin etudes showcased her ability to handle complex, virtuosic passages, while the Rachmaninoff revealed her power and passion. The audience responded with increasingly enthusiastic applause after each piece. After the Rachmaninoff, Louisa stood and addressed the audience for the first time. "For my final piece," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I've prepared something different. A piece written by my son Antonio, who is here tonight." She gestured to where Antonio sat beside Robert in the front row. "It's called Segundo Acto, Second Act, and he wrote it for me during these past months as I found my way back to music." Antonio joined her on stage, sitting beside her at the piano once again. Together they began to play a hauntingly beautiful composition that blended classical structure with Latin American rhythms and harmonies. The piece told a story beginning with hesitant, searching notes that gradually built in confidence and joy, weaving together themes of loss and rediscovery. Robert found himself moved to tears as he watched mother and son play together, seeing in their performance not just Louisa's journey, but echoes of his own parents' sacrifices, his own path from their small grocery store to the heights of business success. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, and soon the entire hall was giving Louisa and Antonio a standing ovation. Robert stood with them, clapping until his hands hurt, watching as Louisa took her bows, first with her son, then alone, her face radiant with a joy he had never seen before. The housekeeper was gone. The artist had returned. The success of Louisa's performance at the Kaufman Music Center created ripples that neither she nor Robert could have anticipated. A music critic from a local arts magazine had attended the concert and published a glowing review, describing Louisa as a revelation, a pianist of exceptional emotional depth who brings fresh perspective to classical standards through the lens of her unique life experience. The article included the broad strokes of her story, the promising career interrupted by family obligations, the years working as a housekeeper, and her recent return to music. The writer had done some digging and discovered that Louisa had once been considered one of Colombia's rising musical stars. The piece ended with a question: what might the classical music world have missed during Gonzalez's 15-year absence, and what might we yet discover now that she has returned to the stage? 2 days after the concert, Robert hosted a small celebration dinner at his penthouse. Daniel and his wife were there, along with Antonio and Louisa. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and animated discussions about music. Robert found himself watching Louisa throughout the evening, struck by how different she seemed from the quiet, efficient housekeeper who had moved invisibly through his home for years. "I have some news," Daniel announced as they were finishing dessert. He looked at Louisa with a smile. "The director of the summer concert series at Bryant Park read the review of your performance. They have an opening in their schedule next month. One of their pianists had to cancel due to health issues. They'd like you to fill in." Louisa's fork clattered against her plate. "Bryant Park? But that's a much bigger venue," Daniel finished for her. "Outdoors, thousands of people. They want you to play a 45-minute program." "That's wonderful news," Robert said, raising his glass. "Congratulations, Louisa." But Louisa didn't reach for her glass. Her expression was a complex mixture of excitement and fear. "I don't know if I'm ready for something that big," she said quietly. The recital hall was one thing, but Bryant Park? Antonio put his hand over his mother's. "You're ready." "Mama, you've always been ready." Later, after the guests had gone, and Antonio had returned to the small hotel room Robert had arranged for him, Louisa lingered in the penthouse. She stood by the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "You don't have to do the Bryant Park concert if you don't want to," Robert said, joining her in the living room. "There's no rush." Louisa looked up at him, her eyes troubled. "It's not that I don't want to. It's just happening so fast. 3 months ago, I was cleaning your bathroom. Now people are writing articles about me and asking me to perform in concerts." She shook her head in disbelief. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dreaming, like I'll wake up and be back in my old life." Robert leaned against the piano. "Is that what you want? To go back?" "No," she said without hesitation. "But this new path, it's overwhelming. And I worry about what happens when what?" Louisa met his gaze directly. "When you get tired of this project?" "Of me." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. "Is that what you think this is? A project? Isn't it? Rich man discovers his housekeeper has talent, decides to help her out of boredom or guilt or whatever it is that motivates men like you to suddenly take an interest in people like me." The hurt must have shown on his face, because Louisa immediately looked regretful. "I'm sorry. That was unfair," she sighed. "It's just that all of this depends on you. The lessons, the practice time, the connections. What happens when you move on to something else?" Robert walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. When he turned back to Louisa, his expression was serious. "First, this was never a project. Yes, I was surprised and impressed by your talent, but what's happened since then?" He paused, searching for the right words. "It's been as meaningful for me as it has for you." Louisa looked skeptical. "Before that night I heard you play, my life was—" Robert gestured vaguely at the luxurious apartment. "Full of things, but empty of purpose. I built a company, made more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and for what? To sit in meetings all day and eat dinner alone every night?" He moved closer to the piano, to her. "These past months, watching you reclaim your passion, seeing you reconnect with your son through music, it's given me something I didn't know I was missing." "And what's that?" Louisa asked softly. "A chance to use what I have, money, connections, whatever, for something that matters. Something real." He smiled slightly. So no, I'm not going to get tired of this. But I do understand your concern about dependency. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. That's why I've been talking to Peter Williams. He runs a foundation that supports musicians from underrepresented backgrounds. They provide grants, performance opportunities, recording sessions. I showed him the video of your concert. Louisa took the card, turning it over in her fingers. What did he say? He wants to meet you. I think the foundation might be interested in offering you a fellowship, funding that would allow you to continue your training and performing independently, without relying on... He hesitated. Without relying on my patronage. The word hung in the air between them, patronage with all its implications of power imbalance. I never thought of it that way, Louisa said quietly. As patronage. It felt more like what? Friendship, she said simply. The word warmed something in Robert's chest. Yes, that's what it is. They talked for another hour, making plans for the Bryant Park concert, discussing repertoire options, and strategizing about the meeting with the foundation director. When Louisa finally left, the penthouse felt emptier than it had before she came into his life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Louisa practiced with renewed intensity, working with Daniel on expanding her program to fill the longer concert time. Antonio extended his stay in New York to help her prepare, and Robert found himself increasingly drawn into their world. He attended rehearsals when invited, offered his home for practice at any hour, and found unexpected joy in the process of watching Louisa grow more confident day by day. Sometimes in the evenings, after she had finished practicing, the three of them, Robert, Louisa, and Antonio, would share a meal and talk late into the night. Robert learned about Louisa's childhood in a small town outside Bogota, about her father who had worked as a bus driver and her mother who had cleaned houses, just as Louisa had, to support the family. He heard stories of Antonio's childhood, of Louisa playing piano in hotel lobbies to earn extra money when times were hard, of the sacrifices she had made to ensure her son could attend university. In turn, Robert shared stories of his own parents, Chinese immigrants who had worked 16-hour days in their small grocery store, of his father's disappointment when Robert chose computers over medicine, of their eventual pride in his success even though they never fully understood what he did. One evening, a week before the Bryant Park concert, Antonio was showing them pictures on his phone of his life in Bogota, his small apartment, his engineering classmates, the university where he studied, and this, he said, swiping to a photo of a young woman with a bright smile, is Elena, my girlfriend. We've been together for 2 years. She's beautiful, Louisa said, studying the picture. You never told me things were so serious. Antonio looked slightly embarrassed. I was waiting for the right time, actually. He glanced at Robert, then back to his mother. I've been offered a job here in New York, an engineering firm downtown. They were impressed with my studies and offered to sponsor my visa. You're moving here? Louisa's voice was a mixture of surprise and joy. Antonio nodded. If all goes well with the paperwork, I'll start in September. Elena will come too. She's applying to graduate programs here. He hesitated. The thing is, I'll need a place to stay at first until I save enough for an apartment. You'll stay with me, of course, Louisa said immediately. Robert saw a flash of concern cross Antonio's face. But your apartment is so small, Mama. Where would Elena stay when she visits? And what about your piano practice? Louisa's one-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights had barely enough room for her, let alone her son and his girlfriend. And she had been practicing at Robert's penthouse or at the music school because there was no room for a piano in her small living space. I've been thinking about this, Robert said carefully. My company owns a building in Brooklyn, converted warehouse apartments. We keep a few units for visiting executives and clients, but one has been empty for months. 2 bedrooms, good light, and, he looked at Louisa, enough space for a piano. Louisa stared at him. Robert, I can't accept something like that. It's not a gift, he said quickly. The fellowship from Williams's foundation includes a housing stipend. You'd pay rent, but at a reasonable rate, and it would be temporary. Just until you and Antonio find something that works better for you both. Louisa looked at her son, then back at Robert. He could see her weighing her pride against practicality. Think about it, Robert said, not wanting to pressure her. The apartment will be there when you're ready. For now, Let's focus on getting through the Bryant Park concert. Later that night, after Louisa and Antonio had gone, Robert stood by the piano where she had practiced so diligently these past months. He tried to imagine the penthouse without her music filling it, without their conversations, without the purpose her presence had brought to his life. It was the right thing to do, helping her find independence, supporting her move forward in her new career. He knew that. But still, he couldn't help but wonder what would fill the space she would leave behind. The evening of the Bryant Park concert arrived with perfect summer weather, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures that held the warmth of the day without the earlier humidity. By 7 o'clock, the lawn was filled with people on blankets and folding chairs, the crowd much larger than Robert had expected. He sat in the reserved section near the front with Daniel, Antonio, and a small group of people who had become part of Luisa's growing circle of supporters. Peter Williams from the Music Foundation was there, along with several other directors who had expressed interest in Luisa's story and talent. Robert had also invited his assistant Miguel and a few close friends from his company. "Nervous?" Daniel asked, noticing Robert checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "More than Luisa, probably," Robert admitted with a smile. "She seemed completely calm when I spoke to her earlier." Antonio leaned forward. "She always gets quiet before a performance. Even when I was a child, I remember her becoming very still, very focused, like she's gathering all her energy inside." The lights dimmed slightly and a hush fell over the crowd as the MC took the small stage set up in front of the park's famous fountain. After a brief introduction about the summer concert series, he announced Luisa's name, giving a short summary of her remarkable journey from conservatory student to housekeeper and back to the concert stage. When Luisa walked out, Robert felt his breath catch. She wore a simple but elegant red dress that seemed to catch the last rays of the setting sun. Her hair was swept up, revealing the clean line of her neck and shoulders. But it was her walk, her presence that struck him most, confident, dignified, as if she had been performing on major stages all her life instead of cleaning homes. She took her place at the grand piano that gleamed under the stage lights, adjusted the bench slightly, and looked out at the audience with a small smile. Then, without introduction, she began to play. She opened with Bach as she had at her first recital, but this time chose the more complex and emotionally expressive Goldberg variations. Robert watched as the audience, many of whom had come for a pleasant evening of background music to their picnics, gradually fell silent, drawn in by the precision and passion of her playing. As twilight deepened into evening and lights came on throughout the park, Louisa moved from Bach to Chopin to Debussy, each piece showcasing a different aspect of her artistry. Robert found himself not just listening, but watching the faces in the crowd, taking pleasure in their expressions of surprise and delight as they discovered what he had found that night in his penthouse, that music, in the hands of someone who truly understood its power, could transform an ordinary moment into something extraordinary. For her final piece, Louisa stood and addressed the audience directly. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice gentle but clear in the microphone. "For my last selection, I'd like to play something that has special meaning for me. 3 months ago, I was working as a housekeeper in a Manhattan penthouse. The owner was away on business, and I thought I was alone. I sat down at his piano, something I'd never done before, and began to play a piece I hadn't touched in 15 years. She smiled, looking toward where Robert sat. But I wasn't alone. My employer came home early, heard me play, and instead of being angry about my presumption, he helped me find my way back to music. This piece, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, was what I played that night. It changed my life. I hope it touches something in yours as well." As she played the hauntingly beautiful opening chords, Robert felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He had heard her practice this piece dozens of times over the past months, but tonight it sounded different, richer, more confident, infused with all the emotion of her journey. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of profound silence before the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, a standing ovation that continued as Louisa bowed once, twice, and then a third time before leaving the stage. Backstage, in the small tent set up for performers, Robert found her surrounded by well-wishers. Peter Williams was there, excitedly discussing the foundation's formal offer of a 2-year fellowship. A woman who introduced herself as the director of a small music school in Queens was asking about teaching opportunities. Daniel was beaming with pride, acting as an informal manager, helping Louisa navigate the sudden attention. Robert hung back, not wanting to intrude on this moment that was so rightfully hers. But somehow, across the crowded space, Louisa's eyes found his. She excused herself from the group and came to where he stood. "You came," she said simply. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," Robert replied. "You were magnificent. Thank you." Her eyes held his for a long moment. "Not just for tonight, for everything." Before he could respond, Antonio appeared with Elena, his girlfriend who had flown in from Bogota for the concert, and the moment passed. The rest of the evening was a blur of introductions, congratulations, and discussions about Luisa's future opportunities. It was nearly midnight when Robert's driver dropped him at his penthouse. The space felt emptier than ever, the silence more pronounced after an evening filled with music and celebration. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey and went to stand by the windows, looking out at the city lights. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Louisa. "Are you still awake?" "Yes," he texted back. "May I stop by? There's something I'd like to discuss." 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from him in the living room. She had changed from her concert dress into simple jeans and a blouse, but still radiated the confidence and poise he had seen on stage. "I've made some decisions," she said, declining his offer of a drink. "I'm going to accept the Foundation's fellowship and the teaching position at the Queen's Music School just 2 days a week to start." "That's wonderful," Robert said. "They're lucky to have you. And," she continued, "I'm going to take you up on your offer of the apartment in Brooklyn. Just temporarily," she added quickly. "Antonio and Elena will need a place when she moves here in the fall, and my current apartment is too small for all of us." "The apartment is yours for as long as you need it," Robert assured her. "I'm glad it will be useful." Louisa nodded, but he could tell there was something else on her mind. She seemed to be gathering her courage. "There's one more thing," she said finally. "Something I wanted to ask you." She met his eyes directly. "The Foundation is hosting a gala in October to introduce their new fellows. I'll be playing, of course, but also attending as a guest. I was wondering if you would consider being my date for the evening." The question caught Robert completely off guard. In all these months of helping Louisa rebuild her musical career, of watching her transform from his housekeeper to an acclaimed pianist, he had carefully maintained boundaries. Yes, there had been moments of connection, of deeper understanding, but he had always been conscious of the power imbalance between them, determined not to complicate her journey with his own feelings. "Your date?" he repeated, wanting to be sure he understood. Louisa smiled, a touch of nervousness in her expression. "Yes, not as my former employer or my patron. Not as the man who discovered me or helped me. Just as a friend. A man I've come to care about, who I think might care about me too." Robert set down his glass carefully. "Louisa, I don't want you to feel any obligation." "I don't," she interrupted firmly. "That's why I waited until tonight. Until after the concert, after the fellowship offer, after I knew I had options and independence." Her eyes were steady on his. "I'm not asking out of gratitude or dependency. I'm asking because when I was on stage tonight, I realized something. All those people were there, applauding, admiring, but the only person whose reaction mattered to me was yours." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm 50 years old, Robert. I've spent most of my life putting others first, my parents, my son, my employers. For the first time, I'm choosing what I want. And tonight, when I walked off that stage, what I wanted was to share that moment with you." The simple honesty of her words touched something deep in Robert's heart. These past months, as he had watched Louisa reclaim her passion and purpose, something had been awakening in him too. A reminder of what it felt like to care deeply, to be moved by beauty, to connect with another human being not through transactions or business dealings, but through shared vulnerability and joy. "I would be honored to be your date," he said quietly. Louisa's smile lit up her face. And Robert thought of that first night when he had discovered her at his piano, how far they had both come from that moment of surprise and uncertainty. "Good," she said, standing up. Then it settled. As he walked her to the door, Robert felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next for them, whether friendship or something more, it would be built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine connection. "You know," he said as she was leaving, I never thanked you. For what? For using my piano that night? For taking a risk? Louisa reached out and briefly touched his hand. And I never thanked you for coming home early. For listening instead of judging. Her eyes held his. Sometimes the best things in our lives come from unexpected moments, don't they? As the door closed behind her, Robert returned to the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys that had changed both their lives. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm. But inside, in the space that had once felt so empty, the silence now seemed full of possibility.